Video game genres. Some have been around for a while, some arrived a bit later to the party, some might have partied a little too hard. And then there are some that were a lot more prevalent back in the day than they are now. You know what I'm talking about. The kinds of games that make older people say, well, they sure don't make them like they used to anymore. Oh wait, maybe they do actually. In any case, we'll be talking about the genres that go hand in hand with gaming back in the day. And by back in the day, let's just say I'm referring to the mid-80s through the 90s. You know, seeing as a lot of us prefer older games to newer games, it only seems logical that these genres would be the ones we care about the most and enjoy discussing. I mean, you wouldn't go to a horror movie club and say, hey, I got a movie for all of us to talk about. What I found is that most retro gamers prefer games that go left to right. Yep, good old side scrollers. I swear, I view my life through the lens of a side scroller. And sure, there's plenty of older games that aren't side scrollers, but a lot of them were, and this had a huge impact on the type of games we'd see being made. Perhaps the biggest genre synonymous with retro gaming would be platformers, and more specifically, mascot platformers. Something that some people like to blame Sonic for creating, but personally, I like to thank Sonic for creating. Sure, there were some games that might be considered cheap cash grabs that came to follow from Sonic's popularity, where you suspected they were just trying to cash in on a trend. I mean, does this look like a face that you can trust? But overall, we still got a lot of great mascot platformers as a result. I've always felt that platformers are one of the most pure types of video games. The simple concept of timing jumps with the difficulty gradually ramping up to test your skill, all the while navigating enemies. A great excuse for video games to be unrealistic too, with the jumping physics allowing characters to jump 4 to 5 times their own height. Yeah, I'm not quite there. What's interesting about these games is that a huge part of the hook is just coming up with a character that is likable. I mean, sure, people found the Sonic games to be unique and refreshing, but Sonic was about so much more than that. He became a cultural icon to the point that he's still relevant all these years later, despite having a large number of games people consider to be bad. Some series have nothing but games that people consider to be good and were still abandoned anyway. Where the heck is the next Banjo-Kazooie game? I sure can't find it. Some characters just end up being more iconic than others, regardless of how good the game is. Personally, I find Rocket Knight Adventures to be a great game, but it was probably perceived as a Sonic ripoff, which, from a marketing standpoint, really was in a lot of ways. I mean, just look at the cover art, similar color scheme and everything. It's almost like they were hoping some parents would accidentally think it was Sonic. I wouldn't have minded my mom making that mistake. I've always found it fascinating the way the mascot platformer craze turned something already iconic, Donkey Kong, into something iconic in its own new way. From a stationary immobile bum to a frisky bounding hero. Hey, there's hope for all of us. Alright, but then what about action platformers? And what makes them so different from regular platformers? Are they trying to say regular platformers don't have action in them? Talk about tension. Watch your back there, buddy. I found that typically the games considered to be action platformers are similar to platformers, except that you have some sort of weapon in them with an emphasis on combat of some kind to defeat enemies instead of using your character's body somehow. Although technically that would make Rocket Knight Adventures an action platformer, which I'm not so sure I agree with. Luckily for this video, it kinda doesn't matter because both platformers and action platformers are synonymous with retro gaming. One might even consider them to be 1 and 1A. I mean, there's just so many iconic games that can be classified in these categories. Odds are, most retro gamers are going to find at least one of their favorite games here. Next up, we have beat 'em ups, a genre that was seemingly left for dead until it made a bit of a comeback. Funny enough, I'd say this is probably one of the most misunderstood game genres there is, even even by people who like them. To those who misunderstand them, the gameplay experience is just walking around and mashing the attack button as you run into enemies until you progress far enough that the enemies have become strong enough that they overpower you. Then you start losing lives quicker until you get a game over. Now, sure, these types of games can be fun that way, as well as what makes them great for newcomers, but to really get anywhere, you gotta utilize spacing, positioning, and crowd control. Combined with how your moveset can work in tandem with this, it will prevent you from getting swarmed and changes the way you approach the game entirely, as well as what allows you to really start making some solid progress. However, when it comes to a genre where it's difficult to progress far, regardless of whether you're playing the game the right way or not, say hello to shoot 'em ups. A genre I think deserves a spot on this list, and even though it doesn't quite have the same sort of mainstream popularity, it has endured with what I'd call one of the most dedicated fan bases to a genre there is. It's unfortunate that their popularity isn't quite as widespread as it once was, but I kind of get it. Their difficulty often makes people write them off as simple games. Well, not a lot going on here except for me getting my butt whooped. And yet, I'd still say they're one of the most iconic genres simply due to the fact their roots trace all the way back to some of the earlier days of gaming, with games like Asteroids, Space Invaders, and Galaga. And even though some might consider these games to be different genres, there's still an undeniable influence. There were a lot of these games back in the day, and they embraced the retro gaming mantra of easy to pick up and play, perhaps better than anything, or pick up and lose, also very appropriate of retro gaming. Next up, we've got RPGs, a classic example of the types of games where many fans will say they don't make them like they used to. And indeed, many of the most beloved games in the genre came out during the 90s, with RPGs really finding their stride on the Super Nintendo and PlayStation 1, considered perhaps the two best consoles for fans of the genre. Now, this certainly isn't a genre for everyone. These games take too long for some people to play through, and heck, even just 5 minutes could be too long as some people simply don't enjoy them. The story, longer adventure style can certainly be an acquired taste, and like anything with an acquired taste, some people just never acquire it. It's no small ask to acquire this taste either. All it takes is a quarter of your life to play through a bunch of them. Even still, many of the genre's most celebrated games came from the 90s, and most fans of RPGs will likely tell you that at least one of these games was a transformative experience for them. So that seems like kind of a big deal to me. Last but not least, we have run and guns. What's interesting about this genre is that I actually wouldn't say there's a surplus of titles like there are for the other genres I've mentioned, but the ones that were are very fondly remembered and well liked. Heck, Contra alone is almost enough to keep the genre relevant. What kind of monster doesn't enjoy this game? Well, proof that no game is liked by everybody. As one of the genres that kindly tells you what you're supposed to do, in these games, you run and you gun, blast everything on screen, and avoid getting hit yourself. Kind of similar to shoot 'em ups, honestly, and thus why some people often confuse the two. If there's one thing that's been consistent throughout pretty much the entirety of video gaming history, it's that gamers like to blast things. Hey, I'm on board. This is perhaps one of my favorite implementations of it, and one of the best examples of the types of games that retro gamers love to keep coming back to. Okay, so that does it for the genres I'd like to mention, but of course I'd be curious to hear what other genres you all might mention. Maybe 3D platformers? After all, those got started in the mid-90s and were a pretty big deal at the time. I always love me some Banjo-Kazooie, that's for sure. I'd be curious to see which genre you'd suggest, or perhaps why you resonate with one of the genres I already mentioned. So with that, leave your comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games. He's the retro